Now, Mr. Lott, you have 5 minutes in rebuttal, in defense.
Okay.
You can stand here or over here, but look at the audience as well as the jurors. So maybe you'd like to go over here. Might be better.
Okay. Get it right here. Okay, well, thanks very much for having me here. Obviously, this is something that touches all of us. There are a couple of basic questions we have to ask, and that is, if the police can't be there to protect you, do people have a right to be able to go and protect themselves? And also, what's the safest course of action for people to take when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? I think, and I'll just go and list some other questions here. Why is it that every single time around the world that we've had a gun ban, banning either all guns or all handguns, murder rates have gone up? You'd think out of randomness, you'd find at least one time where it stayed the same or went down. But yet every single time it's gone up. If you look at mass public shootings, virtually every mass public shooting that we have here in the United States, and also the many that they have in Europe that we don't hear too much about, keep on occurring in those places where guns are banned. Why do criminals, why do these terrorists try to pick out those places where they don't have to worry about somebody being able to go and defend themselves? And finally, I'd just like you to think about who's most harmed by gun control. I would go and argue it's the most vulnerable people in our society, the people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime, poor blacks, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. It'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect people, but they're not. Here are just some data on police response times. First of all, you may not always have the luxury of time to be able to go and dial your phone and talk to somebody there. But even when you're able to do that, you look at response times. Dallas, 8 minutes and 39 seconds. Fort Worth, 8 minutes and 54 seconds. Austin, Texas, 8 minutes. Places like Detroit, almost 17 minutes. Miami, 14 minutes, and so on. In rural parts of the United States, it can be 20, you may not even have police services 24 hours a day. Police are extremely important in reducing crime. But police understand themselves that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred, and that raises the question what people should do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. You can look at surveys of police. Police One, which is the largest private organization of police in the United States with about 450,000 members, when they're asked on a scale 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are reducing crime? 76% of police officers said that they're either extremely important or very important in reducing crime. Do you support concealed carry? Over 90% of police officers in the country support concealed carry.
You have 2 minutes.
Considering the particulars of recent tragedies like Newtown and Aurora, what's the impact of legally armed citizens? 86% of police officers saying getting rid of gun-free zones, allowing people to defend themselves, could have either reduced or eliminated the casualties. You see similar types of results from police chiefs around the country. Every place in the world, not just Washington, D.C. and Chicago, where murders were falling before their handgun ban and rising afterwards, but you can look at places like Ireland, or you can look at Jamaica, which had its gun ban going into effect in '75. Or you can look at Great Britain, where afterwards, during the next 8 years, there was about a 50% rise in homicides and fell after that, but only because at that time they had an 18% increase in the number of police officers. You look across countries, the United States is the red one there. We're below the median, we're below the mean. If you look at homicide rates, and you look at gun ownership rates across countries, and there's real problems. I'm using the Small Arms Survey, and I'll just tell you they won't release their data for about 85% of, or tell you where they got the data. You find a negative relationship. The countries that have higher gun ownership rates have lower homicide rates. And you can look at homicide rates among developed countries. The United States is higher. Here's the relationship between gun ownership and homicide rates across all developed countries. Again, there's a negative relationship between gun ownership and that. Now, I don't put a lot of weight on purely cross-sectional data. That's the reason why I look before and after the changes because it allows you to try to account for more differences that are there. Thank you very much for your time. But again, if I were to leave you with two facts, one is it's the most vulnerable people who benefit the most from being able to own guns, and it's particularly poor blacks and women and the elderly who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lott. Very well done.
Mr. Lott.
Okay, you have 5 minutes, Mr. Lott, to see if Mr. Elliott favors gun control.
Don't shoot me, I'm only the piano player.
Okay. Well, there are probably plenty of people armed here, so you're probably safe. Anyway,
Or a target.
anyway, it's an honor to be talking to you. I've read a few of your books.
Thank you.
So you think that the media portrays guns fairly accurately? I mean, I recently was going through and looking at TV shows, for example, and just in the last year, you can find dozens of shows that show machine guns being used in kind of normal cop-type settings. Do you know how many murders have been committed with machine guns in the United States since 1930?
I'm sure the answer is too many or none.
Well, it's 2, which is probably still too many. But I'm just wondering, do you really think that the media has given accurate portrayal there? It seems like they want to sensationalize. Let me ask you this. You say it glorifies it. I can easily find lots of cases where police or military people use guns in good ways on TV shows. I've been looking in vain for like the last 7 years or so on TV shows about civilians using guns to defend themselves or others in good ways. There are lots of cases where TV shows show them doing mistakes, accidentally shooting other people or causing problems for the police. But can you think of many cases in TV shows over the last few years where people have used guns, civilians have used guns legitimately in good ways to defend themselves?
I think all the Western TV shows had this idea that the shootout was the way to settle differences.
Okay, I'm saying like the last decade.
I guess Law and Order, I mean, I'm not that much of a TV watcher, but in Law and Order, there's usually somebody who has tried to take the law in his own hands.
Well, that's not good. I'm saying using somebody, because almost all the people that use guns in Law and Order are committing a crime, okay? But I'm just saying somebody using a gun. Anyway, my guess, if people were to look, they would have a hard time going and finding that.
Well, my position about the media, I don't mean journalism. That's, I think, a separate issue. I'm talking about entertainment. We don't look to learn what to do morally in films or TV. It's a cultural effort.
But you were saying it was realistic, and you said an accurate portrayal.
It's a cultural portrayal, not an historical portrayal.
Okay. Well, okay. Now, you were mentioning in your own life or speculating with others about all the problems that might arise when people use guns defensively. I can give you, over the last 5 years or so, literally several dozen cases where, according to police, mass public shootings have been stopped as a result of a civilian with the permitted concealed handgun. How many of those cases have the types of concerns that you've raised occur? How many times have they accidentally shot the wrong person?
I think, first of all, you have to ask them, and secondly, talk to their families. We send soldiers out with guns.
I'm just saying, but let's specifically deal with this problem. You mentioned things that can go wrong, and I'm giving you examples. I'm saying, can you give me one example of a mass public shooting that was stopped by a concealed carry permit holder where any of the types of concerns that you were raising have actually occurred? One example. Can you give me one example?
Objection, Your Honor. He's leading the witness. He's not a historian of all television shows. He's a biographer.
Well, I thought he was brought in as an expert on the media.
I'll allow the question. Objection overruled. You need to watch more TV.
That's the solution.
Law and Order.
That's what I watch when I can't sleep. And I try to figure out what the plot is. Who did what? Who's on trial? Who's the real bad guy? I think gun violence is symbolic on TV and sometimes in the movies because nobody gets hurt except the bad guys. The good guys get wounded. The bad guys get killed.
Well, you don't think people with guns are often shown as buffoons or as causing problems with the police? I can give you a number of recent shows. I mean, you look at The Rookie, for example, on ABC. They're constantly showing cases where civilians are getting in the way of police officers. They show them as racists, the people that have guns. You don't
I'm not
think...
sure that's a good thing. I'm not sure that
Right.
that's a good thing.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. You may sit down now. Thank you very much, Mr. Elliott. Appreciate it very much. Your witness.
Well, thanks very much. It's an honor to have such a top debater here. I was kind of wanted to dive in a little bit to some of the claims that you're making. So you were telling us that people are 22 times more likely to die from a gun, either suicide or shooting somebody that they know, than to use it in self-defense. Do you know where those self-defense numbers are from? They're from. Do you realize that they're from the justifiable homicides from the Department of Justice? And do you realize that about over 90% of the counties in the United States do not report those numbers, and that there's actually a warning that's been put on there saying you should not use those numbers for statistical purposes because most of the country doesn't report those numbers? And so the reason why you get such a low estimate in terms of the number of self-defenses is that the vast majority of the country doesn't even report the numbers that you're using. You realize?
This was not really a question, but the statistics are out of Mr. Sherman's.
Well, Sherman knows the problem. I'm disappointed that he didn't try to help you.
Well, I think you're again you're playing a numbers game.
You're not using my time. Sorry, Michael.
Objection.
You had
Order in the court.
You had the
Order in the
chance
court.
to correct her numbers beforehand.
No,
and
no,
you didn't
there's
use
no
them.
numbers to be corrected.
This can't count to my time going back and forth with him.
John Lott is sustained on this move.
Okay. But why would you use a number that isn't even counted in over 90% of the country, doesn't even count it? And beyond that, I don't know if you realize this, but even the ones that do report it have real problems because when they initially record a homicide, when it's maybe 2 or 3 years later that they determine it's a justifiable homicide, most police departments don't go back and correct those earlier numbers. So even the few percent that report it are underestimating the number of justifiable homicides in there.
As far as I know, we're not here to debate one specific statistics.
No, but I'm just saying, I'm happy. If I had an hour, I'd go through all the statistics that you had. But let's take the other claim that you had about homicides and suicides, the rate that they occur in the home by having a gun. That's based on work by Arthur Kellerman. I don't know if you're familiar with that or actually read the papers, but what he does in those studies is they will go and ask a group of the relatives of somebody who died in or near a residence and ask them whether a gun was owned in the home. And then they assume if a person died from a gunshot and a gun was owned in the home, it was that gun used in the death. Do you realize that even including suicides, 86% of those deaths were actually due to a weapon brought in from the outside
Well, sir,
and not from the gun in the home?
This is a final question, although it didn't sound like a question, but go ahead.
No, I'm saying, do you realize that? Because it's not what you think the number.
Your Honor, where is this going?
Objection sustained.
Again, you're taking my
You're
time
making-
up, Michael.
the final statement.
look, just if you look at the logic, once you have a gun in a household, whether it's brought in or whether it's owned, this normalizes seeing a gun. This normalizes usage of a gun.
That doesn't mean
All of
something
this-
bad happens relative to the benefits.
Well, this makes it more likely for accidents
Time.
to happen.
Okay.
Professor Moody, will you please place your hand on this copy of the Cato Pocket Constitution? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the Second Amendment, so help you the NRA?
Yes, I do.
Please be seated.
Proceed.
Carl, could you tell people a little bit about your background?
I'm a professor of economics at the College of William and Mary. Go Tribe.
Gotta get closer.
Go Tribe. And I teach econometrics and mathematical economics. Even closer?
Yeah.
And I teach mathematical economics and statistics.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you a few questions. We just heard that the United States is unique in terms of mass public shootings. Could you tell me, you've done research on this,
Yes, I have.
what has been your findings and what problems exist with that claim? Is that claim true?
No, that claim is not true. Around the world, there are mass public shootings all the time, hundreds of them, and we just never hear about them.
So what's the percentage of mass public shooters that the United States makes up in the world?
A couple of percent, maybe.
And how does that compare to our share of the world population?
Very tiny. I mean, it's really a very small proportion of the world population.
So we make about 1% of the shooters, but about 4.6% of the world population.
That is correct.
Okay. And are there countries in Europe that have much higher rates of mass public shootings than we have here in the United States?
Finland, for example.
Okay. How about France?
France.
Now, doesn't France have all the different types of gun control laws that they were just talking about?
Yes, they do.
Okay. How about Russia? Doesn't Russia have all the different types of gun control laws that they were just talking about?
Yes, very strict.
And how about Belgium?
Oh, very strict.
And don't those countries... Now, one of the problems that maybe exists with the claims is that they're not adjusting for population. They're just saying the United States, we have 327 million people, and so they're counting up the number of mass public shootings here, and they're comparing it to a country like Belgium or to France or other. Is that the way people normally make comparisons across countries in terms of crime rates?
Not if they're doing it correctly.
What's the correct way of doing it?
Per capita.
Right. So we wouldn't just compare the number of murders in Nevada to California and say California is higher because it has more murders, right?
No, that'd be stupid.
Okay. All right. Well, just trying to be clear here. Can you tell me one place in the world that's banned guns, either all guns or all handguns, and seen murder rates go down or even stay the same?
There is no such place.
What happens every time when
Stay the same or go up.
Okay. And why do they always go up? Why do they always go up? What would be the theory for why banning guns don't produce a benefit?
Because only bad guys have guns, and you are helping the assailant and hurting the victim.
Okay. You would think out of randomness, once or twice, you would get a drop in crime. Doesn't that tell you something, that with all the places that have banned guns, that you can't find one place where it's gone down? And why would that be preferable, to kind of look at the change before and after, rather than the type of cross-country comparisons that we've been hearing about?
Because in a before and after comparison, you're using the same place. Whereas if you're looking at cross sections, you're looking at different places that have thousands of things different between them. For example, in the slide that Mr. Shermer showed, across states, Wyoming was high and had and Massachusetts was low. I can't think of two states that are very much different, that are more different than that from each other.
One more question.
Okay. Who is hurt the most by the different types of gun control regulations? We've been hearing things about background checks. What are some of the things about background checks, the way they're run right now, and who gets hurt?
Well, first thing, they're expensive to run, and the people who are trying to buy a gun usually have to pay for the background check, and very likely that if you have a name that's similar to somebody else's name, you will fail, and the names that are most likely to come up are names of poor black people, and they get denied handguns.
Okay, time.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.